Okay, so good morning to all of you from Europe, and thank you Interior for giving me the opportunity to come to India and to bring to you our own experiences with Euro 6. We have been hearing this morning the big technology lab between BS4 to BS6, and that had happened in Europe already in the past, in the last few years. We have been as well discussing why not to have a BS5, and at this moment I would say that that was being a clever idea. Our experience with BS5 was not positive, and therefore we very strongly moved to a Euro 6 in a shorter time than expected. But I think that the challenge was there, the challenge was met, and we fulfilled the requirements that we had in our roadmap to reduce the environmental impact of heavy-duty traffic. So let's see if I can. Okay. So let me just spend 2 seconds to bring to you what is the Joint Research Center, because of course you might have heard of it, but it's not very clear in your mind what is our goals and why we are part of the European Commission. So the European Research Center, the so-called Joint Research Center, is one of the general directorates of the Commission. Like it could be, I don't know, industry or agriculture or anything else. But unlike the other colleagues that are working in this case in Brussels, we are distributed through Europe, and our challenge is to bring to our colleagues that are working on the regulations, on the different regulation that goes from transport, but that goes through food and health and food safety, to provide the support, the technical support to make those regulations as good or as best as possible. Indeed, we are, sorry, I did something wrong here. Okay. So we are distributed in Europe. We are in 5 positions. Of course, our headquarters are in Brussels, and we have other institutions just in Holland, in Spain, the South Spain, Seville, in Karlsruhe in Germany, and in Geel in Belgium. Where I come from is in Ispra, that's northern Italy, and in there is where our small group has to the challenge to work in all the aspects of transport, not only the technology part, but as well the other softer part of transport, fuels, fuel economy, well-to-wheel analysis, and so on. So, as I said, our goal is to provide technical support to those doing regulations. So just to bring to you what are the topics that we are going to be addressing today, will be a small introduction. I will spend some time in service conformity, which I think is the touchstone of the Euro 6 legislation that have provided, I think, in my opinion, the results that we were expecting. Then I will comment on what are the performance of the Euro 6 from our perspective. Then, of course, the regulation as we see it is not something written in stone, has to be modified as the time comes, and I will address what we have been doing on the in-service conformity assessment and where from those, let's say, experience, how we have moved ahead. And of course, at the end, I will draw some conclusions. So, as you know, any emission standard has 3 components, or at least in the European procedure has 3 components. The type approval part, which is done on the engine in this case, the conformity of production that ensure that the products are in compliance with the type approval, and in our occasions the in-service tests that make sure that the real products are complying with the regulations during the normal life. So what I'm going to address today in a deeper way is the in-service test. Just to remind you what are the limit values, I think you are all aware of that. Something that Euro 6 included is the introduction of the particle number, which is on the right of the slide. And as I said, it's not static regulation, has have several amendments, and we go from the so-called Euro 6A to Euro 6B, C and D, and the last D has been already published last September, if I can remember. What I have put in blue there are the areas that concern the in-service conformity, and in particular what are the so-called power threshold. I will address that in my talk just slightly ahead of time. So the Euro 6 is based in regulation 595/2009. However, the real bulk of the regulation is done in so-called implementing regulation of 2011. And as I said, maybe the cornerstone is the introduction of the particle emission testing, the PEMS testing as a mandatory part of the type approval legislation and during the life of the vehicle, the so-called in-service conformity. Of course, one option that we had when we would like to check that the vehicle during the life is still fulfilling the requirement would have been to take the engine off the vehicle and test it in a test bench. Of course, that brings downtime to the operator and is a very cumbersome thing to do. So we opted for trying to measure the performance of the vehicle on board, and that's where it comes the PEMS that allow us to check if the vehicle with certain amount of reliability is still conform with the expected emission levels. Of course, we are going to measure the vehicle on the road, and we need then to, in some way, to know what are the emissions of those vehicles in terms of grams per kilowatt hour. So we have some mirror provisions to be able to do that. So the in-service conformity testing, as I said, has been repeated several times, is what we think a cornerstone of the success, in our opinions, of Euro 6. It's not only performed during the life of the vehicle, it's performed as well at the type approval, so-called type approval PEMS test. And what the purpose is the verification of the performance of the engine and the emission control system over the useful life. I have put down what is the useful life of the different vehicles in Europe, and of course that might not be one-to-one to what are the vehicle classification here in India. Essentially, M vehicles are buses and coaches, M vehicles are heavy-duty truck under 12 tons, and M vehicles are heavy-duty trucks over 12 tons. So, as I said, the in-service conformity is done on the vehicle operated on the real driving routes with the normal loads and with the professional driver that vehicle will always take. And the first in-service conformity, let's call it, the type approval test is done at 18 months from the first registration of the vehicle with at least 25,000 kilometers. And then every 2 years, that test has to be performed. Just a note here, it's not all the vehicles that are tested in this way. What they are tested are representative vehicles of the family of engines that we are interested in. So it's not that every producer has to test all the vehicles they have been producing in the last 2 years. It's only some representative engines and representative vehicles of that engine family. As I said, for this type, the payload normally between 50 and 60% of the maximum. They have conditions to be tested, which is the maximum altitude, have the temperature, which goes to equivalent to the Euro 6 on the type approval, from -7 to up to 35, 36 degrees. That is something that maybe in India has to be reviewed, because the temperature profile of India is quite different to those in Europe. Although we have extreme temperature, we go from +40 in the South Spain to -20 in northern Sweden. What at the moment we are doing is that the data is only processed as a part of the in-service conformity for hot operations. And we understand hot operations, that operation where the coolant temperature of the engine is above 70 degrees C. We will see that after, when I go through the assessment that we did of the PEMS procedure and how that impact in really in knowing if the vehicle is operating properly or not. Of course, the trip composition is not any other trip. Can be, what I try to say is that the trip is a normal trip, but has to have a certain compositions. For the different type of vehicles, we have different percentage of urban, rural, and highway or motorway operation, and those are defined depending the velocity that the vehicle is doing. For the urban, it's between up to 50 km/h. For the rural, it's between 50 and 75, and from the motorway, it's above 75 km/h. We will see that those, let's say, characteristics will be changed or have been changed for the last version of the Euro 6, the Euro 6D, and why that thing is being done. As well, the length of the test is equivalent to anywhere or longer than 5 times the work performed during the WHTC, which is our World Harmonized Test Cycle, or the CO2 emitted during that test. This is done in order to have enough statistics of the performance of the vehicle to come up with an assessment of the performance that is reliable. Now, going to what we do with the data once that the testing is being performed. As again, not all the data can be used. The data is used only if it's within certain parameters, both of ambient conditions, which are equivalent to those done during the test at type approval, the temperature of the engine, so in other words, the coolant temperature above 70 degrees C, and then what we process the data are not the full length of the data. We are doing subset of those data, and I will just comment that in a few seconds. And the length of those windows, as we call it, therefore we address that as the moving average window, is equivalent to the work done or the CO2 emitted during the test at the WHTC. With those data, and on the left you see its approach is based on work. On the right, the approach is on the CO2 emitted. We can define, we can define the so-called conformity factor for each window, which is the integral of the emissions of the pollutant of interest over the limits. And that conformity factor is the one that we are going to be comparing with the limits imposed for those conformity factor. Equivalently, on the CO2, it's slightly more difficult because, of course, the CO2 will not have the work available directly. So you see on the right part of the slide how the approach is made. It's made, of course, per unit of CO2 emitted, but at the end we have the same, and we'll see that later, the equivalent values in one case or the other. At the moment, and before Euro 6D enters in operation, only those windows that have an average power above 20% of the maximum power of the engines are considered, and you need to have 50% of those windows valid. Equivalent for the CO2 that is transformed in the maximum length of time that that window can last, and that is just a conversion of power and work into time. So those windows, as you see here, is defined. You start, let's say, at time 0, and you move and start adding the corresponding work till you fulfill the one times the work at WHTC, and then you perform the integration of that window and perform the conformity factor for that window, and so on. Then you move again. I put it a few seconds, but the window will move to the frequency of data acquisition, which is normally 1 Hertz. So every second we move the starting of the window, and we move ahead till we fill up the CO2 or work performed. And again, perform the emission and the conformity factor. Of the day, what you do is that you assign to that test the 90th percentile of all the data that you have. So we take the 10% of the maximum emitters, let's say, off of those windows, because those can be values that, for whatever reason, during the performance of the test has gone above the normal standard operation. And with that approach, we are quite confident that the that the engine, it will have been extracted and done a type approval test at the test bench, will have passed the test. The value that that 90th percentile has to be less than is 1.5. So what we're saying is that the maximum value that is allowable for those windows is 1.5 times the regulated emission limit. So how all that thing have come up and give us some confidence that indeed we are fulfilling our roadmap. And I am going to just to refer to a few points that you can find in the open literature. We can find that the emission levels compared with the Euro 5, the Euro 6 are 80 to 90% better in PM and PN, and that is being published in 2015 in an equivalent integer meeting. Or that the heavy duty has led to a significant improvement of the real world emission or performance of Euro 6, again, 2016, last year, in another integer meeting. Or, as you see, when I indicated that the Euro 5 was not fulfilling our roadmap, Euro 6 has performed much better than Euro 5 in terms of how much extra emission limits we can have in real operation. We have a between 1 and 1.5 for Euro 6. However, for Euro 5 was 1.9 or to nearly 4 times. And that's even worse than the Euro 4, that is 1.3 to 2.2. So therefore, as I said, the Euro 5 was not being performing as we were like it to see. Just other operators have done their tests, and here I present values from the Transport for London of 2 tracks. One is 18 tons rigid heavy-duty goods on the left, and you see the performance difference between Euro 5 and Euro 6. And I guess that the most important part for Transport Authority in city is the low power operation, which is here indicated as the low velocity operation of those vehicles. On the right, we are the same. One is another thing that this is for a bus. Again, in the low operation, we are much better than Euro 5. Yes, one small note in the cartoon on the top. It seems to be funny, but it's real. I mean, a heavy-duty bus per kilometer emit less than an Euro 6, and I will not enter an Euro 6 and the diesel point nowadays in Europe. So this is only to indicate that I think the Euro 6, and with all the conditions that Euro 6 impose on the vehicles, those Euro 6 are performing very well. So we have seen that the in-service conformity has done very well the job, but the regulator at the time that this thing was put together have still some, let's say, puzzles to see if this thing will work, and introduce in the regulation the need to assess the performance of the procedure that has been proposed. And that performance done and has been done by the GRC, and have tried to address what are the impacts that cold conditions might have on the performance of the vehicle, what are the impact of different trip parameters, different payloads, influence of the trip compositions, and so on. As well, is that evaluation the right one? I'm sorry. Is the right one to address and assess the performance of the vehicle? But one particular point that was very important to the regulator was the low power operation. And that is understandable, because that low power operation will be happening in the city, where the impact into the population will be larger. So we have done that assessment. We have performing a total of 112 tests with roughly 22 vehicles, and the distribution of vehicles and types are on the table on the right. Some of them were done with cold start, some of them they were not done with cold start, just for comparison. If you are interested in the report, you can just download it from the site on the bottom. Now, very early in the assessment, we saw that the cold conditions are, and when I say cold condition, means operation of the vehicle with coolant temperature below 70 degrees C, are very important. You see in this graph, most of the emissions in an Euro 6 vehicles is done on that part of the trip, where we are still in the warming up period. The other thing that we saw very easily is that we have, as I said to you before, we have a power threshold to define the valid window. That power threshold was set at the time of the onset of the Euro 6 at 20% of the power, the maximum power, but we saw very early that we eliminate most of the low power operations of vehicles, and that means most of the impact that those vehicles has on the urban conditions. And here you see it better. This is an N2 track performing their trip, and by introducing the 20%, most of the urban operation is not considered in order to assess the performance of the vehicle. As well, the distribution of urban, rural, and highway were in some way very different to those that are expected on the WHTC, and the tendency to operate those vehicles always in the top end of the bracket of velocity. So if the urban was on the 0 to 50 km/h, most of the vehicles, although supposed to be in urban operation, were operating on the high, nearly the 50 km/h, for one simple reason. They would like to have the temperature of the SCR and the right temperature so the SCR is operating properly. The other condition as well is that the order that those urban, rural, and highway is done. On the left, you see the same the test of a vehicle, the vehicle V5, where we have started with urban, then rural, and then highway, and the same vehicle operating in the opposite direction, starting by highway, continue with rural, and then urban. As you notice, the emissions, and that are in red in the graphic, are much different in the urban operation. In the first case, of course, the vehicle is a low power. The vehicle is not yet operating at the optimum point of the SCR, so the NOx reduction by the SCR is not so efficient. In the second case, the vehicle is being already warmed up during the highway and urban and rural operation, and of course the SCR is operating in the optimum temperature range and therefore have a high efficiency, and no NOx is, or nearly no NOx is seen. The other point that were put to us is we have two approaches. One is the work-based window, the other one is the CO2-based window. So we did as well a comparisons of, for the same trip, the same vehicle, what are the results if we approach it in one way or the other. And as you can see, that approach, one or the other, are equivalent. There are some points that they are not, but there are few, and I am not going to enter in the discussion why they were not. Essentially saying one of the cases is because the validity of the window in one case or the other were not the same. The other thing is when we put together all these conditions, I'm talking about cold start, included or not, the 20% power threshold, the 90th percentile. And so you see, by introducing all these boundaries, what we are is taking away more and more the amount of data that we can use to assess the vehicle. In some occasions, gets up to 60–70% of the data is not used for the assessment. And of course, that is something that we wouldn't like to see. Sorry. So here you see how much data for different vehicles, if you include or not the cold start, for different type of vehicle is left behind by introducing the 70%, the 70 degrees C. It can be 30%, 50% for some of the type of vehicle, or even higher than 50% in some other type. By introducing the power threshold at 10%, that is very much reduced. So we only take off something like 20% of the data is being not used for the assessment. So all these things together came with a conclusions that the PEMS approach is a valid approach. However, it needs to be tuned up in order to be able to make sure that the assessment of the vehicle on the road is valid. At that moment, we left that the payload will be the same. We keep again the same units for the windows. We test as well other units, rather to be one WHTC work or CO2 maybe half or twice. The duration, we just advise that to be no more than 5, as was in the previous case, but between 4 and 6. I said between 4 and 6 because that gives flexibility to the operator that during the test they don't see how much work is being done. It's not done. It's not known until afterwards. So just to give us some flexibility. But on the other side, not to go to, as we have seen, up to 8–10 times the work, because that dilutes the areas of interest, which were in this case the urban operation. The 90th percentile is still operating very well, and therefore we suggested to reduce the 20% power sharehold as well for the urban operation consideration up down to 10%. And something that we, of course, analyzed was the impact of the cold start operation and how we can introduce that in the procedure. So just as a summary, to say that those advice that we gave to our colleagues in the regulatory part of the Commission was taken over in discussion and in consensual with the OEMs and the vehicle manufacturers, and the new Euro 6D introduced a clear indication of what is the order of the test need to be performed, and I'm referring in this case has to start always by urban. Introduce as well that the power sharehold has to be more than had to be at 10%, and introduce as well that we need to look to how to treat cold start as an important part of the emission, let's say, fingerprint of the vehicle. And we were as well indicating that at the moment the in-service conformity is only done on gaseous pollutant. We need to introduce as well the particulate, and indeed we are working very hard to introduce the particulate into the whole process, and we are very close to that. The cold start is a more complicated one because we need to perform tests at cold operation conditions, and we need as well to arrive to an approach that is not too heavy in giving importance of that 5 minutes or so of cold start that any vehicle will have to the full vision of how the vehicle performs. So just as a final message to you is to say Euro 6, as it is implemented in Europe, is working very well, is fulfilling what are the targets that we imposed ourselves when we started. Secondly, in my opinion, and that is my personal opinion, not the Commission opinion, the jumping of Bara 4 to Bara 6, I think is a clever way just to avoid our own experience with Euro 5, which in some way did not perform as expected. And as in many other technological areas, the learning from already others make possible for you to do that leap from one place to the other. Example that we have is the telephone area, where many areas of the world don't have cables. For the telephone, they have only cellular telephones. So they did the big quantum leap. I think your quantum leap here is not as big as that. And of course, we have plenty of problems, but I think that to eliminate or not to go through that process of going to Euro 5 will be always positive. And with that, I thank you for your audience and open to any questions.